There's a country in the middle of Africa where the streets are cleaner than Singapore's, where the murder rate sits lower than France's, where the share of women in the national parliament is higher than anywhere else on Earth, higher than Sweden, higher than Iceland, higher than every country that spent decades patting itself on the back for gender equality. Where a city that had bodies in its streets 30 years ago now has fiber optic internet running into its villages and the fastest growing tech sector on the continent. And where 1 million people were killed in 100 days. That last line doesn't seem like it belongs with the others. But it does. This is the same country. The clean streets, the parliament, the fiber cable. All of it exists in the same place where, between April and July of 1994, neighbors killed neighbors with machetes and clubs. Where churches full of people looking for sanctuary became massacre sites. Where the radio told people to murder their friends, and a lot of them did. And where the rest of the world watched, calculated, and ultimately decided not to step in, while somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million people were killed. Nobody counted carefully enough at the time to know the real number. And that gap in the record is its own kind of indictment. 100 days. That's the fastest, most intensive stretch of mass killing anywhere since the Second World War. There's no comfortable way to open a video about Rwanda, because there's no version of this story that lets you keep your distance. The usual travel content trick of framing a place as exotic, as somewhere else, as somewhere the normal rules don't apply. The genocide in Rwanda happened because the rules applied completely. Because colonial administrators needed a tidy way to classify a population and drew a line through a society that had never drawn it that way before. Because radio works just as well for broadcasting instructions to kill as it does for playing music. Because the international community has an actual, documented process for choosing not to intervene in a genocide. And in 1994, it followed that process almost exactly. This happened to people who are still alive today, in a country that is now, by the measures that matter most, one of the most remarkable stories of national transformation anywhere in the modern world. How does a country that went through the worst thing human beings do to each other turn, in 30 years, into an argument for what people are capable of at their best? That's the question we're chasing here. The answer isn't simple, and it isn't free of cost. But it exists, and it's one the rest of the world, which hasn't exactly been paying close attention, probably needs to hear. Land in Kigali, and the first thing that throws you isn't what you expected to find. It's the absence of what you expected to find. No litter, for a start. Kigali's streets are cleaner than most European capitals, and not in the way of a city with an army of street sweepers papering over the mess underneath. There's just not much mess to paper over. Gutters are clear, sidewalks are swept, the flowers on the roundabouts get watered and trimmed, public buildings are kept up, taxis actually run on the meter. That cleanliness isn't cosmetic, it's basically written into law. On the last Saturday of every month, from 7 in the morning until noon, the country more or less shuts down. Shops close, traffic stops, and every citizen, from the president down to the youngest working adult, is expected to take part in Umuganda, a mandatory day of community labor where neighborhoods clean their streets, fix up infrastructure, dig drainage channels, plant trees, and generally maintain whatever public space they share. Umuganda isn't a new invention. It's a pre-colonial tradition. a form of communal labor that existed long before colonization and was revived, formalized, and made compulsory by the post-genocide government as one of the pillars of rebuilding the country. Structurally, it's not unlike the Norwegian idea of dugnad or the Balinese subak system. The shared assumption, backed by law and social expectation, that the physical space you live in is everyone's responsibility, and showing up to look after it isn't optional. Kigali itself is built across hills. Ridges and valleys, steep roads, sudden views, neighborhoods that spill down into valleys and climb back up the other side. In a landscape that's genuinely one of the more dramatic of any African capital. It rains hard twice a year, and between the buildings, the vegetation is thick and green, and the morning air, before traffic picks up, smells like wet soil and eucalyptus. The city sits at 1,567 meters, high enough that the altitude takes the edge off the equatorial heat. Kigali doesn't cook the way you'd expect. It's warm and bright, and on the days when the sky over the hills turns that deep, saturated blue, it's genuinely beautiful. The Kigali Convention Center, which opened in 2016, is a building that announces the country's ambitions in glass and steel. A silver, ribbed dome rising above the hilltop, visible from most of the city. It's hosted the African Union Summit, Commonwealth Heads of Government meetings, international investment forums. It was built deliberately to be the kind of structure that makes someone landing in Kigali revise whatever assumptions they walked in with. It's working! But the building that matters most in this city is smaller than the convention center and doesn't announce itself at all. It sits on a hill in the Gisozi district, and from the outside gives no hint of what's inside. It's the Kigali Genocide Memorial, and that's really where this story has to start before it can go anywhere else. Her name is Claudine Uwera. She's 41. She was 11 years old in 1994. Today she teaches secondary school history in the Nyamata district south of Kigali, Rwanda's history, including the genocide, to a classroom of kids born after it happened. Some of whose parents were perpetrators, some of whose parents were survivors, and some, in ways that don't fit neatly into either category, were both. She lost her mother, her father, 2 brothers, and her grandmother during the 100 days. When she talks about how she survived, she does it with the flat economy of someone who's told the story enough times that it's been worn down to its facts, without embellishment, without performing trauma for an audience. Neighbors hid her at real risk to themselves. She doesn't call that remarkable. She calls it the thing that happened. One of the things that happened in a stretch of time when extraordinary things were happening in every direction at once. Afterward, she went to school. She doesn't treat that as remarkable either. There was a school, you went. What else was there to do? She's telling us this in a classroom set up for our conversation. A map of Rwanda on the wall behind her next to a printed copy of the Ndi Umunyarwanda campaign, a national identity program launched in 2013 that translates roughly as, I am Rwandan. Not Hutu, not Tutsi. Those words don't appear as ethnic categories in the post-genocide constitution. They're not on identity cards. They're not part of official discourse. They haven't been erased from history. Claudine teaches that history, and those words are central to it. But by deliberate constitutional choice, they've been stripped out of the legal and civic vocabulary Rwandans use to identify themselves to the state and to each other. The Ndi Umunyarwanda campaign isn't a euphemism, it's policy. And Claudine, who has to teach it, has a fairly specific view of where it works and where it doesn't. More nuanced than either the government's official line or the international criticism of that line. because she's been living inside the policy for 30 years, and none of it is theoretical for her. It's what she navigates every day, in a room where she knows the family histories of the kids sitting in front of her, some of which contain things the national identity policy asks everyone to hold in a way that isn't always easy.
She won't say the policy is wrong. She won't say it's right either.
What she says is that it's the thing Rwanda is doing, and that doing something is different from having finished it, and that the children who grow up inside it now seem different to her from the children who grew up right after the genocide, when the wound was still raw, and doing something hadn't yet become stable ground to stand on. There's a Kinyarwanda word she uses, agaciro. It translates as dignity, but it's bigger than that. It means the kind of dignity that comes from self-determination, from being the author of your own story instead of a character in someone else's. The word shows up in the National Development Plan, in speeches, in the policy documents behind Rwanda's reconstruction, and she uses it in class. She asks her students what it means to them. The answers, she says, are always different, but they're always answers. The word gives them somewhere to reach. She's been teaching for 15 years, and she plans to keep going. In a classroom where the children of killers sit next to the children of the people who saved lives, she teaches history and dignity, and the one word that somehow holds both. It might be the hardest job in the world. She doesn't describe it that way. She just calls it teaching. Rwanda is the most densely populated country on mainland Africa. Just over 26,000 square kilometers, roughly the size of Maryland, packed with 14 million people, around 530 per square kilometer, in a country with no oil, no significant mineral wealth, no navigable rivers, no coastline, and none of the natural resources that usually give a poor country its shortcut to foreign investment. What Rwanda does have is land, and the land itself is extraordinary. The country sits on the Albertine Rift, the western branch of the East African Rift System, the geological crack running down the continent that's carved out the chain of Great Lakes and volcanic highlands stretching from Ethiopia to Mozambique. Rwanda's western border runs along Lake Kivu, one of Africa's Great Lakes, deep and cold, sitting at 1,460 meters, so still on calm mornings that the volcanic peaks of the DRC on the far shore reflect in it almost perfectly, doubled, until it's hard to tell where the mountain stops and the lake begins. To the north are the Virunga volcanoes, 8 peaks straddling Rwanda, Uganda, and the DRC, some rising past 4,500 meters, covered from the mid-slopes up in Afro-montane forest so dense and wet and old that it generates its own weather, pulling clouds in off the lowlands and staying permanently misted in a microclimate that doesn't really exist anywhere else in Central Africa. Inside that forest live mountain gorillas. There are roughly 1,063 of them left on Earth, and virtually the entire global population lives within a few hundred square kilometers of that one stretch of forest. Nowhere else. It's the most geographically concentrated of all the great apes, and also the only great ape whose numbers have recently started moving in the right direction, up from around 620 in 2008 to over 1,000 today. It's the only known case of a great ape subspecies pulling back from the edge of extinction within living memory. Rwanda's role in that recovery is specific and well documented. The Gorilla Tourism Program, a small number of daily visitors paying permit fees that currently run around $1,500 for a single hour with a habituated gorilla family in Volcanoes National Park, funds ranger salaries, anti-poaching patrols, community benefit programs in the villages around the park, and ongoing conservation research. The logic behind it is almost embarrassingly simple. A gorilla alive in the forest is worth more to the local economy than a dead one, because a living gorilla generates revenue year after year, and a dead one generates nothing. That calculation, obvious once you say it out loud, genuinely radical inside conservation economics, has reshaped the relationship between the communities around the Virunga forest and the animals living in it. A generation ago, gorillas were being poached, caught in snares meant for other animals, squeezed out as farmland crept further up the volcanic slopes. Now local people work as guides, trackers, porters, and rangers. The park is a livelihood, not just a boundary line on a map. Walk into Volcanoes National Park early in the morning. Mist still heavy in the bamboo zone, where cultivated land gives way to protected forest. And at some point, you notice a presence before you actually see it. A branch moving with no wind behind it. Then the undergrowth splits open, and you're 3 meters from a silverback, looking back at you with an expression that isn't fear and isn't aggression. It's curiosity. The same curiosity you're feeling, aimed right back at you. Rwanda's government protected this. The communities around the park made that protection economically viable. And the result is that this exact moment, 2 primate species briefly recognizing each other on a misty volcanic slope in Central Africa, is available to the world today in a way it wasn't 50 years ago, and might never have been if the math had worked out differently. But the gorillas aren't the most remarkable recovery story here. That's nature bouncing back once the pressure eased off. The real story is human, and it's harder to look at, harder to explain, and more important than anything else in this video. To understand what happened in Rwanda in 1994, you need to understand what happened in 1933. And to understand 1933, you need to understand what didn't exist before Europeans showed up at all. The Hutu and Tutsi distinction in pre-colonial Rwanda was real, but it wasn't what colonial administrators later turned it into. It was mostly economic. Tutsi loosely meant cattle owners. Hutu meant farmers. The categories moved. A family that acquired cattle could become Tutsi within a generation, and one that lost its herd became Hutu. People intermarried, spoke the same language, shared the same religious traditions and history under the same kingdom. The line was soft and situational. The Germans, who colonized Rwanda first, found that distinction useful and hardened it. The Belgians, who took over after the First World War, hardened it further in the specific bureaucratic, pseudo-scientific way European colonial administrations tended to classify populations in order to govern them more efficiently. In 1933, Belgian administrators ran a census and issued identity cards. Every Rwandan got classified as Hutu, Tutsi, or Twa, and the classification stuck. No longer fluid, no longer contextual, no longer something a family's circumstances could shift over time. Now it was a fixed, documented, state-verified identity on a card you carried. One that shaped your legal status, your access to education, your job prospects, your entire relationship to the colonial state. The Belgians used the Tutsi minority to help administer the Hutu majority, a standard colonial move, since a population aiming its resentment at the middle administrator rather than the ultimate colonial power is easier to control. The resentment built for decades. When independence came in 1962, it broke open. The following decades brought waves of violence against Tutsis, waves of refugees, and governments that kept the identity card system running and used it to organize discrimination. By 1990, when the Rwandan Patriotic Front, a mostly Tutsi exile force that had grown up in Uganda, invaded from the north, the country was already in civil war. In April 1994, the plane carrying President Juvenal Habyarimana was shot down over Kigali. The killing started within hours. It was organized. Lists of names had already been drawn up. Roadblocks went up on the first night, and at the roadblocks, people's identity cards got checked. Tutsi on the card meant you were pulled out of the line. What happened next is documented in testimony held by the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, in oral accounts collected by the survivor organization Ibuka, and in the physical evidence still preserved at the specific churches, schools, and hospitals where people had gathered, believing the sanctity of the building would protect them. It didn't. That identity card, a piece of Belgian administrative technology from 1933, designed purely to make colonial rule more efficient, became, 60 years later, an instrument of death. The line drawn through a society that had never drawn it that way became the line at the roadblock. This isn't a story unique to Rwanda. It's a story about what happens when a colonial administration decides the most efficient way to govern people is to make their internal differences permanent, official, and inherited. Versions of it show up across the colonial world, and there's a lesson in it about the bureaucratic machinery of mass violence that isn't comfortable and isn't safely confined to the past. Rwanda knows this. It's made it a matter of constitutional policy to acknowledge it, teach it, and keep the memorial sites open, not as monuments to victimhood, but as evidence, permanent and physical, of exactly what that line on the identity card led to. At Murambi, in the southern province, on the grounds of a former technical school where roughly 45,000 people were killed over a few days in April 1994, the remains of victims are preserved inside the school's own classrooms, a deliberate decision by Rwandan authorities and survivor groups made against real pressure to bury the remains instead, because, in their judgment, the visible evidence of what happened is the most reliable defense against it happening again. The remains are still there. The classrooms are still open. Rwanda decided you should see what that line actually produced. By the end of the 100 days, roughly 70% of the country's population was female. Men had died disproportionately, as perpetrators killed in the counteroffensive, as victims specifically targeted, as refugees who fled and never came back. The country that emerged from the genocide was, demographically, a country of women, many of whom were suddenly heads of households, caretakers of orphaned children, managers of farmland with no male labor left to work it. And without much other choice, women started governing. The Gacaca courts, the community justice system Rwanda set up in 2001 to process roughly 120,000 people accused of taking part in the genocide, far more than the formal court system could have handled in under a century, were run in most of the country primarily by women. The elected lay judges who heard testimony and delivered verdicts on genocide participation were women, not because a policy said they had to be, but because they were the ones there to do it. The results were visible. A justice system that had ended up run by women out of sheer necessity produced verdicts that communities generally accepted as legitimate, a level of legitimacy the formal international tribunal in Arusha, working through a handful of high-profile cases at enormous cost over many years, never quite matched. The government noticed. And the conclusion it drew wasn't that women deserved a seat at the table as a matter of fairness. The conclusion was that leaving women out of governance was simply an inefficiency Rwanda, with 120,000 cases to process and a country to rebuild from almost nothing, couldn't afford. Today, Rwanda's Chamber of Deputies is 61% women. The Senate is 38%. The Cabinet is half women. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is a woman. So is the Governor of the National Bank. The Chief of Police has been a woman. Proportionally, no other parliament on earth comes close. This wasn't driven by some sudden moral awakening among Rwandan men about gender equality. It happened because the genocide wiped out the demographic and institutional scaffolding that had kept men in charge, and the women who stepped into that vacuum turned out to be competent, and a government trying to rebuild a country from nothing needed competent people wherever it could find them. And it turned out half the population, the half that had been systematically shut out of power, had plenty to offer. The constitutional quota that now reserves 30% of parliamentary seats for women just formalized what the emergency had already proven. It didn't need a social revolution to take hold. It needed an election system willing to honor what the Gacaca courts had already demonstrated. There's a lesson here the rest of the world hasn't been especially eager to learn. Maybe because learning it means admitting the country learned it from a genocide. And that's not a comfortable line to trace. But it's there. And Rwanda hasn't erased it. Rwanda teaches it. None of this means the transformation is uncomplicated. It's real, measurable in GDP growth, in maternal mortality statistics, in tech investment, in guerrilla counts, in how clean Kigali's streets are. It's also required things the international human rights community hasn't been willing to look past, and that Rwanda hasn't fully answered for. Paul Kagame has led Rwanda since 2000, first as de facto leader and then as elected president, in a style independent observers consistently call authoritarian. The space for political opposition is narrow. Journalists who've published investigations critical of the government have ended up arrested, exiled, or dead under circumstances that haven't been transparently investigated. And the 2003, 2010, and 2017 elections all returned Kagame with margins independent monitors found hard to square with how the campaigns were actually run. The identity policy, stripping Hutu and Tutsi out of official discourse, has drawn criticism from some human rights scholars who argue it suppresses legitimate political identity rather than genuinely building civic unity. The concern is that forcing a society to bury the categories its trauma was organized around doesn't heal the trauma, it just pushes it underground, where it can't be processed publicly and tends to accumulate instead of fade. The government's answer to this isn't dishonest, even where it's incomplete. It argues the political restrictions are a temporary necessity for a country rebuilding from genocide, that critics invoking press freedom and pluralism haven't lived somewhere those freedoms were once used to organize mass killing, and that the treatment appropriate for a healthy patient isn't necessarily what's appropriate for one that was dying 30 years ago. That argument has real force. It also carries real risk. Temporary exceptions have a way of becoming permanent. A governing party that restricts freedoms in the name of stability can slowly become a party that restricts them in the name of its own survival. And a population that accepted those restrictions when they were genuinely needed can end up, a generation later, without the institutional tools to change the government if it stops deserving to stay. Rwanda's transformation has happened under Kagame. Whether it can survive him, whether the institutions and civic culture and economic structures built over 30 years of authoritarian stability can hold without that stability propping them up, is a question Rwanda hasn't had to answer yet, and one every outside observer needs to keep asking. What's fragile in Rwanda isn't obvious at street level. The roads are clean, the guerrillas are recovering, the parliament is majority female. GDP keeps climbing. What's still thin is the soil underneath political pluralism, the institutional muscle memory of a government that can actually be voted out and replaced once it's overstayed its welcome. Rwanda has 30 years of this. The democracies the world tends to hold up as models usually have 2 centuries of messy, contested, frequently failing but ultimately self-correcting practice behind them. Rwanda doesn't have 200 years. It has 30. Whether that's enough, whether the roots go deep enough to hold once conditions change, is something Claudine thinks about too, in her classroom in Nyamata. She said as much when we asked her. "We are still building," she said. "We are not finished." And people watching from outside need to understand that unfinished is not the same as failed. She's right about that, which is exactly why what happens next here matters more than most of the world seems to notice. In the village of Umbio, in Rwanda's southern province, there's what's known as a reconciliation village. It was set up in 2011 by Prison Fellowship Rwanda, an NGO that had been working with genocide prisoners since the late 1990s, in partnership with released perpetrators and survivors who chose, without coercion, with nothing beyond subsidized land as an incentive, to live together in the same community. Around 60 families live in Umbio. Roughly half are survivors. Roughly half are released perpetrators who served time for genocide participation through the Gacaca process, received community forgiveness as part of that process, and chose to settle not back in their home villages, but here, in a community built on the idea that the only way forward for either group was through the other. The most documented relationship in Umbio is between a man named Celestin Mutungirehe and a woman named Chantal Kantarama. In 1994, Celestin took part in the killing of Chantal's family. In 2011, he moved to Umbio, where Chantal was already living. Their first meeting, the first time they'd been in the same physical space since 1994, has been recorded by researchers at the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation in Cape Town, in accounts too raw to reduce into something more digestible than they already are.
It wasn't a moment of grace. It wasn't, in any cinematic sense, a scene. It was two people, in one place, with a history between them that can't be resolved or made narratively tidy, quietly beginning the unglamorous daily work of living near each other without one of them killing the other. That's continued for 13 years now. Celestin helps fix Chantal's roof when it leaks. Their kids play together. Researchers who study Umbio are careful about the language here. This isn't reconciliation in the sense of the wound being healed. It isn't healed. Nothing lost has been given back. Nobody who died has come back. What's grown in Umbio instead, what Chantal described to a researcher in 2019 in a passage that's been quoted in more academic papers on post-conflict reconciliation than almost any other single source out of Rwanda, is something she called, in Kinyarwanda, a kind of peace that isn't happiness. Not happiness, a kind of peace.
It's a distinction most people who've never had to make it wouldn't think to draw. Happiness would suggest the loss has been made up for somehow. A kind of peace only means the person carrying it has found a way to keep living alongside it, in a daily negotiation that never resolves but doesn't destroy them either. In 2019, a journalist visiting Umbio asked Chantal whether she had forgiven Celestin. "I have let him live next to me," she said. "You can call that what you want." The journalist called it forgiveness. Chantal just repeated, "You can call it that." She wasn't granting permission. She was pointing out that the word the journalist needed and the things she'd actually done weren't quite the same, and that the space between them was where her actual life was taking place. Umbio isn't a model for anything. It's not a policy, not a program you can scale up. It's 60 families in one village who chose the hardest available option instead of the second hardest, and who keep choosing it, 1 year at a time, with no guarantee of what it adds up to. In the most precise sense, that might be what Rwanda actually is. Not just the clean streets and the parliament statistics and the guerrilla numbers, real as those are, but 60 families in Umbio, Claudine in her classroom, the memorial sites in old churches, the Gacaca verdicts in the archives, the open question of whether any of it holds once Kagame is gone. All of it held together by 14 million people refusing to be only what those 100 days made them. So, how does a country that lived through the worst thing people do to each other turn in 30 years into an argument for what people are capable of at their best? Here's the answer, and it's not the tidy one the question seems to be fishing for. It isn't a story about healing or grace or the redemptive arc that our need for narrative resolution wants a genocide to eventually deliver. The answer is incompletely, imperfectly, at real cost, with real compromises, documented failures, unanswered questions, and wounds that haven't healed and won't heal within the lifetimes of the people carrying them. The answer is Chantal in Umbio, saying, "I have let him live next to me. You can call that what you want." The answer is Claudine in her classroom, teaching history to the children of perpetrators and the children of survivors, teaching them the word agaciro, dignity, self-determination, the right to author your own story, and asking what it means to them, and getting a different answer every year from different kids in a country that keeps changing from the one their parents were born into.
The answer is not transformation in the sense of the past being overcome, because it hasn't been. The memorial at Murambi is still open. The remains are still there. Rwanda has made a constitutional decision that the past will not be described as overcome, that it has to be seen and known, because the alternative, the comfortable forgetting most post-atrocity societies eventually settle into, is exactly the condition under which it happens again. What Rwanda is building, on top of a wound that hasn't healed, under a government that asks for more credit than is comfortable to give, and tolerates less criticism than is comfortable to accept, is the specific, partial, contested, daily practice of a society that has decided to keep going. Not to be happy, not to be healed, to keep going. And what Rwanda actually asks of the rest of the world, this country of 14 million on a cluster of hills in the middle of Africa, with no oil, no coastline, no strategic weight to any major power, isn't admiration, and it isn't sympathy. It isn't the comfortable distance of a world that watched in 1994, chose not to step in, and has spent the decades since processing that choice in various ways. What it asks for is attention. Honest, uncomfortable, sustained attention to what it actually costs to keep going after the worst thing imaginable. To what trying actually looks like up close. To the difference between the clean streets, which are real, and the road out to Umbio, which is longer, harder, far less photogenic, and where the real work of becoming a country is still happening, one day at a time. The guerrillas are recovering. The parliament is majority women. The streets are clean. The kids in Claudine's classroom have the word agaciro. And 60 families in a village in the southern province are living next to each other, 1 year at a time, building something that doesn't have a name yet in any language. Rwanda is 30 years into the longest journey it has ever taken. It hasn't arrived anywhere. It's still going. And that, the going itself, might be the most important thing that's happened on this continent in a generation. There are other countries out there doing the hardest thing, in the places where it costs the most. If you want to keep paying attention to them, you know where to find us.